Well, first off, thank you very much to Lucy and CBAN for having me here today. And it's, I am not a, oh, where is it? Is it going to come? If I clap my hands, it. I am not a scientist, and I come at this as a political scientist, and I kind of feel like I'm the token Canadian on the panel here, just to kind of give a little bit of Canadian context and help situate the kinds of issues that the two previous panels have been raising in the context of where we actually at in Canada with this particular crop. So the issues that I'm going to talk about and just give you a little bit of an understanding of why we've arrived at this juncture. There are some key concerns that are being raised both regarding Health Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and how they've dealt with SmartStax in the regulatory process. Specifically with Health Canada, the biggest concern, of course, is that they didn't specifically look at this product before it came and before it was approved by the CFIA. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency, another issue that hasn't yet been raised this evening, but is one of the big questions around this particular product, is that the refuge area, and I'll describe that shortly, the amount of area that has to be planted next to this SmartStax crop has been reduced significantly. And this is a refuge area that's intended to slow the growth of resistance to these pesticidal proteins. And some of the questions that we have around that really have to do with the transparency around how that decision was made, the role of outside experts, which have typically been involved in previous discussions around creating the refuges. There's issues around the reproducibility of data, because independent scientists can't actually get at the data, and questions around monitoring and surveillance. So I'll go through that a little bit, and then finally I'll talk just a little bit about the whole issue of socioeconomic considerations when it comes to the approval of GMOs in general in Canada. This is an issue that's coming up regularly. It features in the debates that are going to be happening in the Parliamentary Committee over the coming weeks. And the question here, and it relates to Michael's comments about Codex, is by approving this product through a relatively lax regulatory system, is the Canadian government putting our farmers at risk again when this product is potentially going to be exported? So just to give you a little bit of context, Canada really got into the biotechnology business in a big way in 1983 with a planned out national biotechnology strategy. And about 10 years later, the regulatory framework was developed for how are these products going to be evaluated. And that framework has been gradually modified, pardon the pun, over time to take into account new considerations and new products coming down the line, including a number of years ago there was a consultation on how are we going to deal with stacked traits. But I would argue that essentially the regulatory framework, there's a scientific rationale in how it was set up, but there was also an economic rationale. It was also designed to be efficient. And this, fits with the times in the early 1990s. Canadian government was very concerned about Canadian competitiveness and wanting to ensure that we didn't fall behind the United States and that we were moving products that were safe or reasonably safe out onto market quickly. And I think that has to do, well, these things affected our regulatory system in a number of ways. There was a decision made. First off, there are a number of regulatory departments in Canada. The underlying department that's really responsible for these products is Environment Canada, but then each of the departments that had previous expertise in the areas of health and environment and whatever took on that part and dealt with those areas. So for example, once the Canadian Food Inspection Agency was created in '97, carved out of Agriculture Canada, they took on the feed safety issues with GMOs and also the environmental assessment. Health Canada, for example, deals with the food safety assessment for GMOs. Having said that, GMOs are not singled out in the Canadian legislation. That was quite a political decision, and that was made early on to say we're not going to treat these products as distinctly different from the products of conventional breeding or even new foods. Like let's say there's some new nut or new fruit that's being exported out of Ecuador into the Canadian market that Canadians have not had a history of consuming, you know, they would also fall under the novel foods category. So instead of genetically modified organisms being the category that we're looking at through the regulations, it's novel foods and plants with novel traits when it comes to genetically modified plants, and that's part of a larger category. By contrast, around the same time in 1990, the European Union specifically brought in regulations that focused on genetically modified organisms, and really that's where the language, we didn't even have that language in North America in the early 90s, and the term GMO that we're all pretty comfortable with now really came out of the European Union saying that's the distinct category to look at here. Of course, the issue that's been coming up today in regards to how Health Canada deals with this product is the question of whether it's fair to assume that the sum is, or that the whole is no different from the sum of the parts. And I would argue that the reason that that's exactly the assumption that Health Canada's made here, and we have a regulatory system that's allowed SmartStax to not have to go through a distinct evaluation because each of the combinations of two or individual traits had previously been assessed, that system was really designed for efficiency, because there's a lot of products that are going to be coming down the pipeline in the coming years that are going to be all kinds of combinations of traits. And so from a regulatory perspective, you know, if you only have to look at it once, well, that's easy and it's cheap, but it only makes sense if it makes sense scientifically, and that's where the concerns that Ricarda and Michael have raised suggest that maybe it's questionable from a scientific perspective. It's interesting, Michael brought up some of the allergenicity questions, and of course a whole bunch of some of the scientific studies that have questioned some of the assumptions underpinning the regulatory model, but there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect between this regulatory system that's designed to move products through fairly efficiently, and then you see some of the scientific papers, for example, written by Health Canada scientists. The quote that I have here was from a paper from 2003, one of the Health Canada scientists talking about how in general the international community of scientists lack validated models for allergenicity. This deficiency creates a serious problem for regulatory agencies and industries. The Health Canada does use the decision-making tree that was developed under the FAO, and that's really what would lead to a good sort of initial screening. I mean, there's still fundamental questions about can you predict when a protein is going to be an allergen, and you generally can't, and so there's always questions that are being raised there. But at least we are using this decision-making tree, or Health Canada is using this decision-making tree when they get the product. Now, of course, with SmartStax, they didn't see the product, the combined trait product. The whole way that Health Canada has dealt with SmartStax and the assumption that we're not dealing with something new and different here really stands in contrast to, in 2001, the Royal Society of Canada, through a federal government initiative, they were commissioned to create an expert panel to evaluate where does food biotechnology come from, how good is our regulatory system, and where is it going into the future. Can we have confidence in our regulatory system? And the Royal Society of Canada came out, I think, with 63 recommendations. And I'm not going to go into the analysis they did of this concept of substantial equivalence that underpins our system, but they did point out that if you're going to be comparing a genetically modified food to already existing foods, you need to do that at a certain level of detail. And so they argued the new food should not differ from its existing counterpart in any way other than the presence of the single new gene and its predicted phenotypic trait, based on a detailed assessment at 4 levels: DNA structure, gene expression, proteomic analysis, secondary metabolite profiling. And this, they argued, was if you can prove substantial equivalence at that level of detail, well then we think you've got a good basis for making a decision.